Welcome to our program. The University of California Free Speech Alliance is dedicated to the absolute right to lawful freedom of expression. Gentlemen, there's a lot of things we have to cover. A lot has happened since we first scheduled this meeting in June. We had the July 4th injunction with Missouri versus Biden, which I'm sure everyone who's watching this is already familiar with. And then September 8th, there was an erroneous clerical error.
Supposedly. Yeah. I can clarify what happened there in the circuit court.
All right. Well,
yeah.
Mr. Tucker and Dr. Kheriaty, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn you loose to do with this subject, all these subjects as you will.
And we have to jump right in on this erroneous clerical error. It's been a circuitous path going through the courts, and it's easy to get lost in all these things. So
yeah,
tell us about the erroneous clerical error, and then give us an update on where we are.
Sure. So as Mike mentioned, on July 4th, the district court judge issued a broad injunction granting our request for a preliminary injunction against the federal government in Missouri v. Biden, enjoining several of the defendants that had been named in our lawsuit, several federal agencies that, as we have alleged, have been colluding with and pressuring and coercing social media companies to do the government's bidding when it comes to censoring disfavored content, censoring content critical, for example, of the government's COVID policies, but as we learned on Discovery, also censoring content on many other issues of public importance, from foreign policy to monetary policy to highly contentious issues in American public life, like abortion and gender affirmative care, on basically any hotly debated topic in the United States. The government had its thumb on the scale.
Just to be clear about what an injunction is, this is before trial. The judge looking at all the filings and says, there's so much evidence here that's actually justified for me to intervene before trial to stop this, because we're seeing rights being violated in real time.
Yeah.
If the plaintiffs are correct, this is a disaster. Let's make sure that this doesn't continue before and during trial. So let's just go ahead and restrain federal government and keep the federal government restrained by the first amendment principles.
Yeah, right? That's exactly right, Jeffrey. And it's worth noting that the legal threshold for a preliminary injunction is very high, precisely because it is the court stepping in. This is not a final ruling in the case, but stepping in very early based on just the initial evidence submitted and the limited discovery that the court grants before trial. The government says, first of all, we believe the plaintiffs are likely to succeed on the merits of their arguments, even before the adversarial process of the trial. And we believe that irreparable harm is going to be done to the plaintiffs and to other Americans if we don't step in right now and try to put a stop to what is very likely unconstitutional activity on the part of the federal government. So that's a high threshold. You can not be granted a preliminary injunction, but still ultimately prevail in the final ruling of the case. Not at all unusual for that to happen, simply because the bar for an injunction is very high. But the court did grant an injunction. The government appealed to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit narrowed that injunction, but upheld the core principles of the injunction and named 4 government agencies that the circuit court believed we had submitted more than sufficient proof to establish that the White House, the CDC, the FBI, and the Surgeon General had likely violated the Constitution. So the circuit court enjoined those 4 entities. The government appealed that injunction to the Supreme Court. And this week, the case was actually before the Supreme Court, except we had a wrinkle again at the circuit court, because we had submitted a petition a week prior to the circuit court asking them to reconsider their narrowing of the injunction. We believe that we had sufficient evidence also to name other federal agencies, especially CISA, which we can talk about later. Jeffrey, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which in our estimation is sort of the central clearinghouse for government censorship. They're kind of a central switchboarding operation, if you will, for all the other federal agencies involved in censorship to funnel requests or to funnel pressure to the social media companies. And so we asked the circuit court, thank you for the injunction, but can we have oral arguments and some additional written arguments to make our case that the injunction should not have been narrowed? And on Wednesday of last week, the circuit court granted that request for kind of a rehearing on widening the injunction again. And then I think they realized the next day, oh wait, we have to give the government time to respond. So they claim to have made a clerical error in granting that request. And they said, okay, well, the government needs time to respond. So that day, the government submitted their response as to why we shouldn't have a rehearing. And we're expecting the circuit court soon to sort of grant or deny the request for a rehearing after considering our argument and the government's response to our argument. I anticipate that they're going to grant that request. And basically what the Supreme Court said, because they were supposed to rule on Wednesday, the Supreme Court reached out to us and said, hey, we're going to wait until this issue of the rehearing is sorted out at the circuit court before we take up the government's appeal. So more than likely what's going to happen is we'll either have a reconsideration of whether to widen the injunction at the circuit court. If we don't, then the government will appeal the injunction again to the Supreme Court. Or if the injunction is widened, I anticipate the government, of course, will appeal that as well. So very soon the case is going to end up at the Supreme Court for the purposes of ruling on the injunction. Once the Supreme Court decides on that question, the case will go back to the district court to move to the next phase, which is moving into the trial phase.
Yeah,
that's right.
So we're looking at years away before we get to that. To say nothing of the appeals of the trials and so on. This is a long time. I have to ask you a question concerning the narrowing point. You've read all the opinions, the evidence that's out there. I have to ask you sincerely, do you think that there were any grounds at all that were non-arbitrary for the narrowing of the injunction? In other words, when you look at the bulk of the evidence, did you have more evidence to enjoin the CDC and the Surgeon General and the White House and I think it was the FBI you said was mentioned?
Yeah.
More so than you did for those agencies that were left out of the initial injunction, like CISA and State Department? I'm not. Tell me.
State Department, Department of the Treasury, the Census Bureau was also involved in censorship.
I mean, do you think that there was
SH?
Could you make an argument?
It's a good question. I think the evidence against the four entities that were enjoined is easier to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
Than the evidence against CISA and the other agencies. And here's why. It's easy for a judge to see that there's coercion happening when you have emails between Rob Flaherty, the White House chief of digital communications, emailing a senior executive at Facebook and berating this person and literally dropping F-bombs and throwing tirades and indicating that the president is very, very unhappy with you because you're not complying with these requests. And then you see some pushback from Facebook, but with repeated sort of pressure and berating and veiled threats, Facebook finally caves in and concedes and censors accounts that include parody accounts that are satirizing the president or the first lady. So that's a form of pressure and coercion that is kind of interpersonal and easy to comprehend and an obvious violation of the First Amendment. This is clear state action on the part of this person who is representing the White House. But that's only, I would argue, 1% of 1% of the censorship that we are seeing now. And the real action happens in ways that I think, given the lack of precedent for this kind of thing in prior Supreme Court cases, is harder. It's going to be harder and probably take more time for the courts to grasp, because what's really going on, besides those sort of egregious one-on-one interactions where that kind of evidence is clear and distinct. What the government has actually built up, what I call the censorship leviathan, or what Michael Schellenberger calls the censorship industrial complex, is a very well elaborated machinery that operates oftentimes by outsourcing a lot of the censorship work to quasi-private entities like the Stanford Internet Observatory or Graphica or the Atlantic Council or the Virality Project, which is a collection of these entities. I call them quasi-private because most of them are funded by the government. They get huge grants from the government, and there's a revolving door of personnel that go between government agencies and these quasi-private entities. So these are basically government cutouts that the government outsources a lot of the censorship work to. CISA basically serves as a funneling mechanism. And so they're presenting themselves as doing nothing but sort of communicating requests that were kind of a pass-through between other government agencies and the social media companies, sort of a neutral carrier of information. And I think if the court just looks at that function narrowly defined, they could say, well, I'm not sure that this agency is directly pressuring the social media companies.
Right.
But I think what the court needs to hopefully develop is an understanding of how this machinery works as a whole,
right,
to flag content, to funnel requests, to run basically a sort of switchboard operation that's literally going 24/7. We have thousands of people, literally thousands of employees working for these quasi-private entities and for these government agencies 24/7 to flag posts and funnel them through CISA to the social media companies. And unless you kind of understand the context of the big stick of the government behind all of these requests, quote unquote, it's not necessarily obvious if you take one component or another, or what one agency or another in isolation, that agency is exerting the pressure. So unless you see the Leviathan, unless you see the machinery operating as a whole, I think it's just harder to grasp. So in our re-argumentation, which hopefully we'll get at the Fifth Circuit, we'll be able to make this case and hopefully paint a clearer picture of how the government censorship machine is functioning as kind of one big entity, this giant blob, and each of the parts has their own sort of role in this process.
And some of it is a result of the exigencies of discovery, right? So you've
that's true as well. Yeah,
the political appointee at the White House is, hey, screw you guys, you're messing up. You shouldn't let this post go anywhere. That's terrible. And so they're less sophisticated actors in some ways.
Right? That's right.
They're blunt, and they're putting English sentences that other people can realize, like, take down this post. But the people at CISA or at the Virality Project or some of the other higher level, more professionalized institutions, there's more winking and nudging going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so the discovery doesn't come up with fireworks. I mean, it's a little like, we all followed the Fauci emails, right? We know how Fauci writes every email as if it's subject to discovery,
Yeah, no, these people are slick and they're subtle.
Yeah.
And the courts have made it clear, by the way, that threats of coercion don't have to be explicit for them to be operating in the background with these sorts of things. And I think the other thing that's important for the American people and the courts to acknowledge, and the courts actually have acknowledged this, including the circuit court, is that it's not just overt coercion or jawboning or shaking my fist at you and dropping F-bombs that constitutes unconstitutional state action. It's also basically any form of what the court calls significant encouragement. And so even significant encouragement without overt threats or pressure or coercion is unconstitutional when it comes to free speech. If you read carefully the language of the First Amendment, the free speech clause in the First Amendment uses not the language of preventing speech. It says the government shall not abridge speech. And the meaning of that word is to diminish in any way the ability of Americans to speak their mind. And so it doesn't necessarily have to involve the kind of most egregious violations, or most obvious, I should say, violations of the kind committed by the White House and other actors, the FBI. We had plenty of evidence of the same kind of thing. Much more subtle forms of pressure that constitute significant encouragement are also unconstitutional. Basically, the government needs to stay out of content moderation entirely. Otherwise, it's violating the Constitution. So, as soon as it's trying to change content moderation and pressuring the companies to actually change their content moderation policies, that's where the real bang for your buck happens. We have evidence we've submitted to the court of basically interactions that go as follows. So, the Friendly Neighborhood Government Agency shares some information with the social media companies about these dozen accounts that we think are spreading disinformation. And hey, you may want to look at this to see if it violates your own company's terms of service. And then Facebook or Twitter comes back and said, yeah, we looked at this and we don't think these things actually violate our terms of service. And then the government comes back and says, well, you may want to strongly consider changing your terms of service. Nice social media company you have there. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. You might want to think about changing your terms of service such that these posts would violate your terms of service. And then with back and forth and with pressure and with coercion, the company caves and actually changes their policy. Yeah. And this is how you end up with hundreds of thousands of accounts of ordinary Americans being censored literally tens of millions of times with these kinds of operations. So it looks like the social media companies are operating independently. They have their own terms of service, but little do people realize that those are being modified and those are evolving according to the government standards of trying to coerce speech and trying to control the flow of information online.
What's remarkable about this is your description of a full industry with many layers and levels, and an established raison d'etre, and that everybody in it is aware of. The job of these many thousands of people is to keep content offline that contradicts the current political priorities. I mean, that's sort of, and they don't have to say this every day in every post and every email. That's the reason they exist.
That's right.
And it's what's startling about this case really is that it sort of unearthed this thing that's actually quite mature and has been around for a very long time, but it's never really gotten attention. I'm not sure how long it's been around. I guess we could argue about that, but it's long enough to be what you describe as a real industry. It is an authentic, big industry with its own internal social codes, ways of communication, networks of connection and relationships, and people moving from job to job, from here to there, and they all understand, and without ever having really questioned, wait, are we the baddies, right?
Exactly.
Never actually asked that question. They're just doing their jobs.
That's exactly right. And so when we say censorship industrial complex, that middle term, the industry, should be taken quite literally. It also has its own training programs and full-time career opportunities. So you go to a place like Stanford or the University of Washington or Harvard, or there's several universities that have set up these quasi-private government cutout. Some people have called them gongos, government-controlled NGOs. Stanford Internet Observatory, University of Washington has their own outfit. And you can go and get trained in, fighting disinformation, and then you can get a full-time public or quasi-private job in one of these entities doing this sort of work. And you're right, there's an internal culture where everyone knows what they're doing and everyone knows the kinds of narratives that need to be stopped. And they even
Quite messed
invent
up.
new terms so that, you know, the term malinformation
Right.
is true information that contradicts our preferred narrative. And so they, you know, they don't even have to claim anymore that the information that they're censoring is false. And of course, now we know that much of the information that was censored was true, and it was censored precisely because it was true, and therefore it was a threat to the government's harmful policies during COVID. So yeah, it is an industry. It has its own internal norms, and I trace the history of the industry, at least in its current iteration, back to early 2017, right? So two things happened in 2016 that our ruling class and our elites, I think in both parties, this cuts across partisan divides, decided, you know, could never happen again. And that was, number one, the election of Donald Trump, and number two, the Brexit vote in the UK, right? These were things that were not supposed to happen. And democracy is all fine and well, but we have to protect democracy against populist movements. We have to protect democracy from the demos, from the people, which has its own irony, right? This rabble that doesn't know what's good for them can't be allowed to do this sort of thing. And the way to make sure that they don't is to control the flow of information where most people get their news, which is online and especially from social media companies. So that involves—
That's a very important point too, because, you know, you have to think back at the history of communication and where people got their information. You know, first we started with the telegraph, not a great threat. Radio came along. With it came the Federal Radio Commission. Once that became TV, it became the Federal Communications Commission. And with that became a lot of federal controls, right? You fast forward all these years, now we've got the internet, not a problem. It's just universities, no big deal. Email, all right, fine, you can email each other, but social media blew it all open.
Yeah, that's right.
Social media began to invade the space of, you know, mainstream news, and there was a narrative collapse. And then pressing issues. Look what happens when we no longer control the public mind. We get Donald Trump, we get Brexit.
Exactly.
So something has to, we've got to put this genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. People may recall that Facebook was blamed for the election of Donald Trump, and Mark Zuckerberg got a real drubbing. I think he's still trying to do penance for his sins by trying to cooperate with the censorship industrial complex. Although I will say, one of the things that surprised us, Jeffrey, on discovery is that we thought that ideologically, the social media companies would by and large be aligned with the government interests. And it may be hard to establish overt coercion because it would look very cooperative. But as it turns out, there's many, many instances where it was clear the social media companies at the highest level of executive leadership wanted the government off their back and tried to decline or deny or resist government interventions initially. And it really took a lot of wearing down before they finally caved in. So it's clear also that it wasn't in their own interests to do this. They didn't do it cooperatively. They did it under significant pressure, coercive pressure, and significant encouragement, as the courts found. And so, you know, this is a very serious problem for civil society. The social media companies sort of want it both ways. They want to be treated like a common carrier for purposes of protecting them from liability. You know, they don't want to be responsible for libel or slander or other things that most publishers are responsible for if they print information that has not been fact checked. And at the same time, they want to consider themselves to have editorial control over content, right? So they sort of want to have it both ways. And Section 230 of federal law of the Communications Act does allow them to have it both ways, right? Does shield them from all liability, but also gives them editorial control to censor and to kick people off their platforms. I think we now know that Section 230 liability, which the government at many points threatened to take away if the social media companies didn't comply with censorship requests, and that would have caused the companies to basically collapse, right? They threatened to take that away, but that's also a useful fulcrum now, we want to permit the social media companies to censor because oftentimes their censorship is going to be aligned with our interests. And when it's not, we can pressure them and make sure that it is aligned with our interests, giving enormous government control over these things that, in my mind, should be considered common carriers at this point. Fine, we can shield them from liability, but then basically they need to be open to all constitutionally protected speech.
Sure, and you have to go back to the founded ethos of all these companies, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook. The idea was to empower the consumer,
that's right.
to give voice to average people for the first time, to be able to reach and have influence over the public mind. And this was considered the great miracle of social media, giving you, I mean, there's a reason it's called YouTube, right? This is TV for you. That was the idea. And everybody was into it, including Zuckerberg, and the rest of them. And that was the ethos of the early 2000s, 20 years ago. And that carried forward for a very long time, and it worked, until it worked too well, and that's when you get the ruling class building this machinery after 2016, 2017. Let's talk very quickly about CISA in particular, because Brownstone editorialized about this, because we're very interested in having that injunction added to the list. It was founded in 2018. The first head of it was this Jan Easterly, I think, who comes out of what's called the NSA, or the National Security Agency, which itself is, I think, a kind of an information offshoot of CIA, right? So there's a way in which CISA itself is part of this intelligence community.
CISA was actually stood up in late 2016, shortly before Obama left office. He founded the agency. And they were supposedly set up to protect our critical infrastructure from attack, right? So the electrical grid, stopping cyber attacks against our internet infrastructure, that was supposedly their remit. But in 2017, again, after Trump took office, their founding director, Jen Easterly, started talking about the need for CISA to protect our election infrastructure.
Wow. And
Americans could think, okay, well, maybe voting machines or election-related security, we have to protect these things from sabotage or misuse. Fine. But as part of protecting our election infrastructure, Easterly also said CISA was responsible for protecting our cognitive infrastructure, one of my favorite euphemisms utilized by the censorship industrial complex. You might wonder, okay, well, I know what our digital infrastructure is. I sort of know maybe I know what our election infrastructure is, but what's our cognitive infrastructure? Well, our cognitive infrastructure is the thoughts inside of your head. And the thoughts inside of your head need to be protected from bad ideas, like the ones we're talking about today during this conversation. And so CISA very quickly, less than a year into its existence, pivoted to censorship, to protecting our cognitive infrastructure. And that's how they became, and maybe they were initially set up kind of with this whole thing in mind. I don't know, that's speculative, but what I do know is that they pivoted within 1 year to becoming a central clearinghouse for censorship, which, as you said, was sort of operating, I think, quietly and behind the scenes until a pandemic. And then this whole thing went into overdrive. And the censorship, of course, was focused mostly at that time on people like you and I who were critical of the government's preferred COVID policies. But again, what we've discovered since then is that once censorship became sort of normalized in the federal government, I mean, I think it got to the point where most of these federal officials, it didn't even occur to them that what they were routinely doing might violate the highest law of the land. It did occur to some of them, including Jen Easterly. We have one communication where Actually, no, it wasn't Easterly. It was one of the players in the cutouts in the quasi private entities, who basically said it's only a matter of time before people figure out what we're doing. Sort of hinted that, okay, I'm aware that this is going to be legally problematic, but I think there were many federal officials, it didn't even occur to them.
Yeah, no, it's
that this was unconstitutional.
No,
it became just so normalized.
CISA lives under Department of Homeland Security.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. And so does FEMA?
That is a good question.
No,
I don't know if FEMA is part of DHS.
Okay. All right, let's just roll back. And people need to understand that, yes, free speech is foundational principle of the free society, but there are implications that come with interrupting free speech, and it's about the control of people. It's not just about people's speech, but the control of people. And just so that people understand how important CISA is in all this, on March 13th, the emergency declaration was passed by March 13th, 2020, by the White House, and the Department of, or the HHS declared the emergency. They laid out a kind of org chart for who's going to be in charge. And the rulemaking body in that case was the National Security Council. About 5 days later, the National Security Council passed it over to the Department of Homeland Security, which I guess outsourced some of it to CISA, because on March 18th, so we're talking about, basically
very early on.
5 days later, March 18th, 2020, CISA is the agency that sent out the PDFs that were clearly demarcating all employees in every industry in America as being essential or unessential. That was CISA. So it's an agency that's not just, controlling Facebook. They're controlling whether your bar can stay open, or whether you can go to work at your television station, or whether you can continue to cut trees, or, they're telling you you can work or you can't work, depending on where you are in this chart. Now, I was talking to a gentleman from Australia who said, well, it's really strange that CISA would be the ones laying that out. Why wouldn't the Department of Labor, which is a
very good question.
It's a naive question, but a very good one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so that's right.
This is the incredible power of these strange agencies about whom very few Americans have even heard.
Yeah, I like to ask people how many federal agencies there are, in the Federal Register, and most people are surprised to learn that there are 434.
Yeah.
The above average, well-informed American can maybe name a dozen, right? We've named half a dozen at least already as part of this conversation, and people could probably come up with a few more, the CIA, the CDC, the NIH, whatever. But 434, most of these are agencies nobody's ever heard of, including CISA, which nobody had ever heard of prior to the Missouri v. Biden case.
Yeah.
And I want to point out one other thing about this case. So I'm one of 5 private plaintiffs, but we have petitioned the court to convert this into a class action lawsuit. Yeah. And that will mean that as a private plaintiff, I'm representing not only myself, who was censored, but any American who was censored, because most Americans don't realize that they have been censored online. Most of the censorship is not the kind of, my video is pulled down from YouTube. I was subjected to that. In fact, the first interview I did after I filed the case against the University of California was with an independent journalist named Allison Morrow. She was formerly at one of the major networks, and then took a job with the government in the state of Washington. And she just continued to do podcasting on the side. After she did her podcast interview with me, she was fired from her day job. And that video was also taken down off of YouTube for supposedly violating their terms of service. our conversation was only about the ethics of vaccine mandates. We weren't even getting into disputes about safety and efficacy of the vaccine. It was a purely philosophical conversation about the ethics of mandating vaccines for competent adults, and that was censored, and she was fired. But most Americans, it's not that explicit when you're censored. You're censored by deboosting search results, by shadow banning, by all kinds of subtle algorithmic manipulations that make it such that you can put stuff out there on social media, but nobody's ever going to see it, including the vast majority of your followers. And the novelist Walter Kern compares this kind of censorship to mixing a record. He said, it's almost as though the engineer is sitting at the sound switchboard and, the algorithms are scraping social media to find, okay, what's trending, what ideas that we don't like threaten to go viral, right, are starting to catch on. And if we see that happening, we could just turn the volume down on the cowbell, right? Little less cowbell, and we can turn the volume up over here on the snare drum. We can artificially boost ideas that we find favorable that are not on their own steam gaining traction just by these kind of algorithmic tweaks, the terms of service tweaks, the knocking out, the knocking off accounts that are, the dozen most influential social media accounts that we don't like. So the Supreme Court has made it clear two things. Number one, obviously the people who are being censored, including the people who are being censored and don't realize they're being censored, are being harmed when the First Amendment free speech rights are violated. But also the listeners are harmed. The listeners or the readers of information are also harmed when free speech is not respected, because Americans have the right to hear both sides of a debate. So you may be thinking, well, I'm not directly impacted by the stuff that they're arguing about in Missouri v. Biden because, maybe I have a Twitter account or a Facebook account, but I only go on to read stuff. I don't actually post things, so I probably have not been personally censored. Yes, but do you realize that your feed is being artificially controlled and managed by government actors,
right,
to make sure that you see only what they want you to see? That is a very serious problem for an open society. That's a very serious problem for a functioning democracy. If you can control our cognitive infrastructure, you can control our behavior. You can control how we vote. You can control what we think about pandemic management because we're never exposed to contrary ideas.
One of the things that troubled me early on when I saw Missouri Biden gaining some traction and getting some success in the courts, and really the momentum was clearly with it, and still is that I couldn't really discern that there was much difference in the way Facebook was behaving or LinkedIn was behaving or YouTube was behaving. It didn't seem to have any kind of effect on really existing censorship. And I was fascinated by that because I thought, well, if this case succeeds, a lot of things are going to change about social media. A lot of things are going to change about management of the public mind in this country. How come all these agencies keep doing what they're doing? Now, I think there is an answer to this, but I will say it's intriguing to me that after the first injunction was released, many of the meetings between, say, the State Department and Facebook were canceled. I mean, I think the New York Times reported this with some degree of panic.
Yeah.
So that's a good sign. But rolling back to your point about just how sophisticated this industry is and how entrenched it is and how they're operating according to sociology and ritual of habit, that is not easily turned around. I mean, I think just a couple of days ago, this guy named Biden, who claims to be president of the United States, was saying that it's terrible that people can go online and find out and read things that are not true, right? He actually said this in an interview just 2 days ago. So you still have this ethos operating out there that they're supposed to be censoring, and they're still doing this. Like, this is the reason for the injunction. It's still going on. What do you think about this theory that the reason we have not seen a great deal of evidence of the rolling back of this stuff YouTube still taking down videos, LinkedIn still
Yeah.
blasting away posts, is simply because it is much larger and more entrenched an industry than we even knew a year ago.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's going to take more than one legal case to dismantle the censorship leviathan. Hopefully Missouri v. Biden will open a breach in the wall, but it'll be a victory. It'll be a battle victory, an initial battle victory in what is going to prove to be a very long war to dismantle this entire complex. There was one promising development, which I think the social media companies have not entirely woken up to. And when they do wake up to it, they're going to start changing. There was a suggestion in the district court's ruling, just a subtle hint, but clearly articulated, that private entities, by willingly becoming or cooperating with or becoming the long arm of a government agency, can themselves be construed as state actors. And what that means is that by cooperating or by not sort of pushing back hard enough or not trying to maintain sufficient distance and air gap between themselves and the government, the social media companies may be opening themselves up to liabilities, civil liabilities under the First Amendment, which means individual users who were censored can then go after the social media companies. And I think right now the social media companies are hedging because they're protected from all liability vis-a-vis their users and their consumers. And they're still operating with the big stick of the government sort of being wagged at them. We don't have a final ruling on the injunction yet. We certainly don't have a final ruling on this case. So I think right now they're also just sort of hedging and asking who's more powerful and who's a bigger threat to our interests. They're operating like a business, right, to protect their own interests. And I think once they realize that if they get in bed with the government and they refuse to disentangle themselves from those government actors, that they could be then liable for civil suits from individual users, and they're opened up to mountains, literally, of liability. Everyone who's been censored, hundreds of thousands of users, most likely, that is going to change their behavior, I think, in very significant ways. So I think we also need to establish that the social media companies themselves are not off the hook, that they are co-responsible for this problem, and they should be held responsible for violating the Constitution.
So civil liability is the enforcement teeth against the social media companies. What is the enforcement mechanism against government officials?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question, right? Going back to Civics 101, the branch of government that's responsible for enforcing the law is the executive branch. And they're the ones who are named as defendants in this case, including the Department of Justice is a defendant in this case. So who's going to police the police? I think the injunction itself is going to have a very robust effect. And the reason for that is every entity that's specifically named, and even the defendants or the other agencies that are not specifically named, will be on notice by the courts that basically if they continue this behavior, first of all the communications can be subpoenaed, right? And they better trust the social media companies enough to, if I'm reaching out and trying to pressure anyone, does the person on the other end, does that executive, are they going to have my back, or are they going to out me to try to protect their own interests? Now that this injunction is in place, it will be much easier to push back. But basically, especially the ones who are specifically named, will be responsible not just for civil liabilities at that point, but also for potential criminal liabilities, because they will be in contempt of court. They will have violated the injunction, and the federal judge can haul them into court, and basically they can be prosecuted. Individual actors in the government can be prosecuted. So that threat of criminal penalty is very, very significant, and the threat of basically everything that I'm doing right now is going to be subjected to future subpoena in this case, and could add to the evidentiary record for the plaintiffs, is going to have a chilling effect as well. The really hard question is going to be who's going to enforce this if we get a final ruling that's similar to what we're seeing with a preliminary injunction, right? Once the case is over, who's going to sort of police this? And are the courts going to try to set up some sort of independent investigative commission? Are the courts going to ask Congress to act in some way to establish oversight over this? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, that's a really hard sort of constitutional and legal question in a case like this.
What are the precedents for this sort of thing? I mean, it's a strange question to ask, because you would think that in this country, we have a specialization in setting up a system in which government is limited, right? So you'd think the answer to this would be obvious, but what actually are the precedents in existence for the Supreme Court saying these executive agencies went way too far and they have to stop doing the following thing? How has that come to be enforced? I mean, what is our legal history that we have to rely on here? I can't even think of many times when that really happens or has happened.
Well, neither can the court, because one of the things that the district court said is, if this is not me talking, this is District Court Judge Terry Doughty, if what plaintiffs allege is true, and by granting the injunction, he indicated it looks like it's probably true. If what plaintiffs allege is true, this is the worst violation of First Amendment rights in United States history. Then the circuit court was searching for sort of precedents that they could draw analogies from. And they basically said, the Supreme Court has really no precedents that we could find for the level of sort of coordinated constitutional violation that we're seeing in this case. So it's not just me saying this, it's a federal district court judge and a unanimous 3-panel circuit court judge, 4 federal judges, saying this case is unprecedented in the literal meaning of that term, that there are no case precedents that can help guide us here. Amazing. And I think there have been instances where independent investigatory bodies were recommended by the courts to sort of inspector general type of a role to oversee the implementation of the court's ruling. I'm not an expert on that, and I need to do a deeper dive into that. But it struck me that even the courts were sort of, that the judges were scratching their heads, saying, basically that this is the worst violation of free speech rights, and it's in United States history, and the level of coordination is something that we've never seen before. The kind of scope and breadth of this thing is something that we've never seen before.
Yeah, you'd think there would be some precedent with challenges to the FCC, for example. Or radio radio broadcasts or something like that. But I think ultimately the legal solution for this needs to be legislative, right? So we got to battle in the courts. We got to battle in the court of public opinion, which is a major reason for this case, just simply to draw attention to this issue, regardless of the outcome in the case. And the American people have to get to the point where they stop embracing censorship. That polls suggest a disturbing number of Americans don't really believe in First Amendment free speech rights. And so we need a shift of attitude. We need Americans to say, this is not the kind of regime that we want to live under. We need Americans to understand this is not a partisan issue, right? In 4 years, the shoe could be on the other foot, and you could be on the receiving end of this, depending on who's in power. This is not something that any American should want. And once that happens, I think we can get some movement legislatively to pass some laws that would attach fines and criminal penalties to individual government actors and agents who do this sort of censorship work. And I think that ultimately is going to be the solution that needs to be put in place. And if Missouri v. Biden can start moving the ball down the field in that direction, that will be success. The work you've done so far is just glorious, and something had to be done to unearth all of this stuff, to expose it, and protect our fundamental rights guaranteed under the Constitution. And we're all grateful to you for all your work here. We're in for the long haul. We're looking at a lot of years
down
the line. So now, I think we heard at the outset of this conversation that we might have some questions that we wanted to that have been pre-submitted. Is that true?
We have questions, but I think this is a good place to cut things.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Jeffrey. Yeah, enjoy the conversation.
Yeah. All right. All the best.